So have Daniel Bessner, who, as I say, it's going to be a very Bessner heavy week because as well as this and the patron episode on Thursday, he's also coming back on Wednesday to talk about Dr. Strangelove with me, Forrest, Jacobin Deputy Editor Micah Utrecht, and philosophy professor Ryan Lake. So that should be really good. Katie Halper, host, of course, of the Katie Halper Show, and Rania Khalek making her debut on Give Them an Argument. Rania, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, thanks for having me on. I'm Rania Khalek. I host the Soapbox channel and new podcast called Left Bitches. And just a warning, I am in Beirut, so it's like 3 a.m. I'm a champion.
Yeah, that's amazing. I can't believe that you're. I can't believe that you're on at 3 a.m.
I do this to myself all the time, but I can do it. It's like a test of like endurance and if I'm like really old or not.
Well, I'm definitely too old to, I would be able to do that, position reversed.
Yeah, no.
What's that?
No way. That's truly.
I hear you because he's going hard of hearing already.
That's right.
Yeah. Older millennials here, I think, right? This is like the older, except Forrest podcast crew.
We're senior millennials. I think actually Rania is full on millennial. I think
I'm pretty much like smack in the middle.
Yeah.
I'm smack in the middle millennial.
Centrist. You're a centrist millennial.
I'm a centrist millennial.
Moderate millennial, yeah.
Yeah. I think I'm on the I think I'm a
we're for sure.
Definitely on the older end of that. I think the annoying USA Today term is zennial. But
I'm millennial identify though.
I'm definitely culturally millennial.
Which means that Joe Biden has no empathy for me.
That's right. Yeah.
Give me a break.
As he shouldn't. Like, we're such a stuck-up, entitled generation that,
we didn't work hard getting arrested visiting Nelson Mandela like he did.
Exactly. We're so lazy. We just can't even, like, pay off our student debt. And
you know what he actually did, by the way? Sorry, I'm just jumping into this. You haven't even introduced me. But you know what he actually did? He had to go through a separate, airport security line because he's white, and it was during apartheid. And that is what he confused with being arrested.
I love it.
It's actually amazing. Yeah.
So like you guys are in the media, like what do people say when they just say, but like what are they thinking when they just say obviously bizarre lies? It's so weird because it's so easily traceable. It's not like 1948 when no one had access to anything and you could like people
might really believe, but Katie has a point. He might really believe that waiting in line in like a weird checkpoint area was like arrest or something, or being detained.
I mean, in the very literal, like arrest, like wait, or stopping. But I think honestly, he's been so coddled. I almost don't blame him. I almost admire it. He's so coddled by the media. As is, by the way, Mayor Pete. I mean, just a reminder, this guy was named to the Department of Transportation, and nobody even mentions the fact that his Smart Streets program resulted in the death of an 11-year-old Black young man named Tristan Moore, and you don't know that name because no one's mentioned it, and it should be a hashtag, TRISTIAN, Moore, MOORE. He was 11 years old. And even if you say, because I don't know enough about transportation, I'm not going to say the Smart Streets program killed a child and has blood on its hands. And I mean, it did do that. But for all I know, an urban planner can say with a lot of certainty, well, it saved these many lives, right? Like saved lives in the net. But the fact that he is so entitled, Mayo Pete, and all of his apologists, that they don't even feel the need to make that point. They don't even have to mention this kid, 11 years old, hit and killed by a car because Mayo Pete's program, Smart Streets, removed a traffic light. It's unbelievable.
Wait, it gets worse because after that happened, so they removed the traffic light, right? And this was at an intersection that a lot of kids use to get to a bus stop to get to school. And so that's how this kid died, trying to get to the bus stop at this big intersection. But then Mayor Pete blamed the kid.
And he darted into the
He was
street
like,
or
he
something.
darted, yeah, he darted into the street, and like, what are you gonna do? The kid just ran into the street. Well, there was no light. Like,
Yeah. Yeah, it's just like that makes me. I do feel like we're living. I mean, the term gaslit is really overused, but like that is an appropriate.
the media coddles these people, except for, and maybe this brings it back to, I guess, what we're supposed to talk about here. When it comes to foreign policy, and if you guys watch the like rapid fire interrogation of Anthony Blinken, Joe Biden's nominee for Secretary of State, by all these neocons like Lindsey Graham, like that's the only time that these people are treated with like skepticism and lots of questions, is to see if they're sufficiently hawkish.
Right. It's like when you agree with someone that a movie is terrible, but for very different reasons. That's how I feel when I'm watching Republicans question Dem noms and picks. Yeah.
And of course, that Buttigieg story really reminds one of what Samantha Power's Caravan did when she killed a young.
Oh, I forgot about that.
Yeah, so it's like an analogous.
What is the Samantha Power's Caravan?
Well, I forget exactly where she was. It was
Ronnie was probably there.
I was probably there. Actually, where was it? Now I want to look it up. Hang on. She ran over like a child.
Yeah, her
car. Yeah, in an African country. Hang on.
Yeah, during the Ebola outbreak, I believe, of 2014, and her caravan ran over a child and killed the child.
It was like a hit and run. It wasn't just like they didn't even like get out to check her. It was really.
She found out.
Cameroon.
Yeah, Cameroon. And so her car went ahead, and she didn't find out about it until later. And she has a chapter in her memoir about it. It really, obviously.
I just like looked it up really quickly. The opening line in The Guardian is that the young boy darted into the road.
Not the caravan. The Mayo Pete one.
No. The Samantha Power one. The opening sentence in The Guardian basically is just, implicitly blaming the child.
So there is an epidemic, a pandemic of Black children darting into roads. That's what it's about. It's not actually about.
It's global. From South Bend, Indiana.
I cannot believe that. Like, I thought you were clear. I can't believe that.
Yeah, stop darting into all these roads when it comes to Democratic policymakers and politicians.
Yeah, and but the important thing is that Pete Buttigieg, this is a really historic thing because he's the first openly gay cabinet secretary who's going to be confirmed by the Senate. There was one active
right.
one. So
right.
They're slicing these first like really thin here, to make this work.
Right, because Trump named one. He just wasn't confirmed by the Senate, right? That's how it works. Yeah, that was amazing. That was like one of the best. Yeah.
Yeah, he is the first openly gay. We have there's like a trans person who was appointed to a position, and now we're getting Harriet Tubman on the $20 bill.
Not just like openly gay, first openly gay.
Yeah, but
confirmed by your
cabinet secretary to be confirmed by the Senate because the Trump one was just acted.
Right.
So, but again, the fact that like even Donald Trump was willing to do this should tell you something about how, whatever, but
radical.
But this is definitely going to be the most diverse, diverse group of people to have ever like bombed and imposed sanctions on a bunch of countries over the course of the next 4 to 8 years. And I want to get into that. I think a natural starting point for us. Do we have the clip of Biden talking about Iraq?
Yeah. Hold on.
And you and I both know, and all of us here really know, and it's the thing we have to face, that the only way we're going to get rid of Saddam Hussein is we're going to end up having to start it alone, and it's going to require guys like you in uniform to be back on foot in the desert, taking taking Saddam down. You know it, and I know it. So I think we should not kid ourselves here. There's stark choices. I happen to agree with your assessment. A, that diplomacy was picked over inspection-driven confrontation. B, that there's an illusion of arms control that cannot guarantee he will have no system of no weapons of mass destruction. And C, that as long as he's there, he's concluded he can absorb airstrikes. So I think you've done a significant service for this country. A different policy judgment has been made. If we don't like the policy judgment, in my view, from observation has been made by the administration and the Security Council and our allies. If we don't like it, we should step up to the ball and say it, because you forced us, and I think properly so, to a day of reckoning here about what our policy should be. I look forward to hearing what you have to say, and welcome, even without the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense.
I'll vote for this because we should support compelling Iraq to make good on its obligations to the United Nations. I'm among those who had serious reservations about and flat out straight opposition to the first draft proposed by the White House on September 19th. The draft raised more questions than it answered. It was not clear whether the authorization requested by the president to use force was limited to Iraq or applicable to the region as a whole. It was not clear whether the objective was to compel Iraq to destroy its weapons of mass destruction programs, to liberate Kuwaiti prisoners, or to end Saddam Hussein's regime. It was not clear whether the rationale for action was to enforce the UN Security Council resolutions that Saddam has flouted for the last decade, or to implement a new doctrine of preemption. And it was not clear whether the administration considered working through the UN and working with allies important or irrelevant. Saddam is dangerous. The world would be a better place without him. But the reason he poses a growing danger to the United States and its allies is that he possesses chemical and biological weapons and is seeking, with his $2 billion a year illegally skimmed from the UN Fund for Food, his oil for food program, for peace program, that he is seeking nuclear weapons.
Contrary to what some in my party might think, Iraq was a problem that had to be dealt with sooner rather than later. I commend the president. He was right to enforce the solemn commitments made by Saddam. If they were not enforced, what good would they be, and what value those institutions? For me, the issue is never whether we had to deal with Saddam, but when and how we dealt with Saddam. And it's precisely the when and how that I think this administration got wrong. We went to war too soon. We went to war with too few troops. We went to war without the world when we could have had many with us. And we're paying the price for it now.
Pause it.
Now, Senator, you voted for this war.
Sure did.
With reservations, but you did
right
vote for it.
Vote too.
So you would vote the same way today as you did a year ago?
I would, but no one can really hold us responsible for the incompetence of the administration in the aftermath. Many, many people said, look, Mr. President, plan for this better before you go.
So then is it any surprise to you that Spain has decided to pull its troops?
I must tell you it's not a surprise, although I want to make it clear I did not predict it or anticipate it. I assumed, like I think the vast majority of people did, without a lot of reflection, that it was likely that you were going to see Aznar reelected.
Democratic Senator Joe Biden is the ranking minority member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Barack Obama and I agree fully and completely on one thing. You've got to have a timeline to draw down the troops and shift responsibility to the Iraqis. We're spending $10 billion a month, while the Iraqis have an $80 billion surplus. Barack says it's time for them to spend their own money, have the 400,000 military we've trained for them begin to take their own responsibility, and gradually over 6 months, 16 months withdraw. John McCain, this is a fundamental difference between us. We will end this war. For John McCain, there is no end in sight to end this war. Fundamental difference. We will end this war.
Governor.
The reason I voted the way I did was to try to prevent a war from happening because, remember, the threat was to go to war. The argument was because Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. So he said that I need to be able to get the Security Council to agree to send in inspectors to put pressure on Saddam to find out whether or not he's producing nuclear weapons. And at the time, I said, that's your reason. All right, I get it. That was the rationale was that's the way to not go to war, because I didn't believe he had those nuclear weapons.
Joe Biden has had an incredible amount of work done. He looks good now. Look at those cheekbones. Oh my God.
He went through a phase where Botox was very badly done. You could tell. It was back during those vice presidential debates with Sarah Palin. But man, he's so old.
Yeah, he's so old. I haven't seen Biden like that in so long. He has that baby face, that baby fat of a 65-year-old.
You know, and he just he can speak more eloquently, and now when he talks, it's just really grandfather in an old person's home. I'm really not trying to be offensive. I know people get really touchy about that, but man,
well, he gets really touchy about a lot of things.
It's very
around a lot of
down
people.
Your neck a little bit.
Yeah, listen up, man.
Yeah, listen, fat.
Listen, fat. That's right. That's awesome.
That was according to Simone Sanders. He was just saying, listen, the facts. Imagine being Simone Sanders playing Mad Libs. It must have been a constant yeah. My God.
Yeah,
man,
the way that he would just yell at voters was amazing.
I'm going like
that. Yeah. Especially because after the 4 years of clutching, liberals clutching their pearls about Trump's, rudeness and, lack of decorum, that they were fine with that. It's the same thing as, the point, was making earlier about how he just again, after 4 years of hearing about, oh, this is terrible, the Trump administration, this is a post-truth world, that, Biden wasn't punished in any way, by the media or by the Democratic Party for just lying about being arrested in apartheid South Africa.
Oh.
And in 2019, September 2019, he claimed, and, we just watched that whole progression of what his positions were in Iraq. September 2019, he claimed that he'd turned against the Iraq War the moment it started. He opposed it the moment it started. Even the Washington Post, said that, fact-checked him on that, which is a rare instance of them bothering to do that.
Now
It's
he
even
gets
worse.
arrested. Oh,
It's
sorry.
even worse with Biden, though, because he actually played an instrumental role in whipping Democratic votes in the Senate to support that war. And one of his closest advisors at the time, Anthony Blinken, is now his Secretary of State. What I will give Biden some credit for, and it's not easy for me to say nice things about him in this respect, is that when he was vice president, he was one of the voices of restraint when it came to a lot of the military interventions in Libya. In Syria, he was, he wasn't a huge voice of restraint, but he openly, there was one time where he came out and openly made a statement about, the weapons that we're giving to the Syrians are ending up in the hands of extremists, and some of our allies are giving extremist weapon. And he called out Turkey and Qatar and the UAE, and then he had to go and apologize to them the next day for saying that. But it was interesting to watch the confirmation hearing for Anthony Blinken, because one of the issues that a lot of the Republicans on the Foreign Relations committees had with Anthony Blinken was that Joe Biden, his boss, opposed the intervention in Libya. And so Anthony Blinken had to reassure them. He was like, yeah, but I was one of the voices whispering in his ear that he should totally do it. And he ultimately did. So I won. So really, it matters who's Biden surrounding himself with. And that's what's really disturbing, because he's not, he's kind of not even there. It's that, you know what I mean? He's not going to be the one making policy. It's the people he's surrounding himself with. And some of them are people who could have been worse, right? It could have been Susan Rice. I think it's better that it's Anthony Blinken and not Susan Rice. I think it's better that it's Lloyd Austin and not Michelle Flournoy, but it's still not good.
God, two men.
Yeah. I would agree with that. And just one thing I want to emphasize for people who don't know, the very first clip was from the late 1990s. And that's because it was under the Clinton administration that a law was passed that made it official U.S. policy to overthrow Saddam Hussein. And so this is actually really interesting, because people always talk about what if Gore was in there, blah, blah, blah. I actually don't think it's so unclear that Gore would have done nothing with regards to Iraq, because, again, that was the policy of the Clinton administration.
So clear, you mean? You said so unclear. You mean you don't think it was so
clear? You
clear?
don't think it's so clear?
So I don't think it was so clear that that Gore wouldn't have invaded Iraq.
I mean, we were on a trajectory, right? The U.S. had spent a decade softening Iraq up with these starvation sanctions that not only like killed 500,000 children under the age of 5, but also just destroyed the country economically, destroyed its education system, its infrastructure, destroyed its society from the inside out. I mean, that's what those sanctions did. So the U.S. was on that trajectory, like Daniel mentioned, and you can kind of see a similar situation with certain countries now. Like, obviously the U.S. already tried to regime change Syria, and it didn't work. But Syria is now facing this really horrible sanctions program that's starving the country, that's really destroying it from the inside out, that's like leading to this brain drain, that's making just life completely miserable in a country that used to be quite self-sufficient. Like, it's not sufficient in anything now, it's completely aid dependent.
That first clip was 98, by the way, to Daniel.
Yeah, so you can imagine, like, I don't think it's totally out of the question that Gore, that Gore could have invaded Iraq. I mean, certainly Joe Lieberman as vice president, would have been, in the Cheney chair, would have been pushing for that. For sure, he might not have done it, but if he didn't do it, one thing I think we can be confident about is he would not have lifted the sanctions in Iraq, stopped the policy of regular bombings that have been happening, throughout the later Clinton years. All of which means that even if there hadn't been an invasion, I mean, what would have happened in those 4 to 8 years of Gore being president would have been pretty brutal, because it's just impossible to imagine him walking back from that. And certainly, I think Afghanistan. I mean, that's just a given. Like, of course, Gore would have invaded Afghanistan.
It's interesting to think of to watch that clip of Joe Biden talk about how Republicans didn't have a plan for after. Right. That was his big criticism in the immediate aftermath of like when the war just like became a disaster, because he went and supported the same thing in Libya. Like, I mean, liberals do it. They just do it differently. Right. And what they did in Libya, I mean, they turned Libya into like a chaotic country that has no functioning
market though.
Yeah. Right. They're open air slave markets, a bunch of, a collection of fighting, militias funded by different countries. Like, there's no stability in that country anymore. They didn't have a plan either for Libya. Like, it's the same. It's like both of these parties do tend to gravitate towards similar ends. They just kind of find different ways of getting there.
Yeah. And I think it is important to know with the Libya thing that like does really show up. One of the things that's most horrifying about that montage of Biden clips, because later on, when he starts to be a little bit more critical, his criticism is that they weren't doing it right. That they have that like there was some way that they could have had like a better plan. They could have done something such that they could have invaded, like cluster bombed, invaded and occupied Iraq, and the Iraqis would have liked it, and there wouldn't have been insurgency and civil war afterwards. And that same delusion is there. Like, even though whatever the differences are between those two wars, like that same basic delusion was there, thinking that you could, that you could topple, like bomb Libya and topple the regime there, et cetera, and that it would be fine.
Yeah, and I think that's really important to emphasize, just building on Rania's and Ben's points, is that there really hasn't been a real discussion about sort of the fundamental principles of foreign policy since, I'd say, the Republican National Convention in 1952, when Robert Taft lost to Dwight D. Eisenhower, and there was someone actually arguing that the United States shouldn't rule the world. So you wind up having, I think, the narcissism of small differences in U.S. foreign policy, where it's like, it's a particular, particularly with liberals in the 1990s and 2000s, it was really about sort of building a coalition to use force as opposed to using force unilaterally, right? And like there's some sort of difference in that. It's not the exact same thing, but the fundamental strategic posture is basically the same, which is that the U.S. is kind of going to use its overwhelming power to use force. So that's what's so interesting about this moment, because even though Trump didn't do much, as we can see, it was proven pretty clearly in his election that bashing U.S. foreign policy isn't really a third rail in any stretch of the imagination. So it'll be really interesting to see what people like Jake Sullivan or Blinken do. I mean, I'm pretty pessimistic, but I think it's also true that 2021 is not, when Blinken was arguing in 2010, 2011 to invade Libya. It'd be interesting to see how someone would approach that situation. I honestly don't know. Again, I'm very pessimistic, but I just don't think it's quite the same thing. But
yeah, and I should say that like that is a really interesting thing about Trump, because I think both things are true. That Trump, by and large, was pretty like much more continuous with previous American foreign policy than not. He actually greatly increased the rate of drone strikes in Yemen. He came. People want to give him credit for not starting any new wars, but that's a little bit. I've always thought it's a little bit like saying, okay, you scattered a bunch of matches around a dry forest, but like, you didn't have an actual forest fire. He did tear up the Iran deal and assassinate Soleimani and etc. All of that could have easily.
Not for lack of trying. It's not for lack of trying, right?
Exactly. But it is interesting that rhetorically, he did sometimes say these very anti-war sounding things. Like that's actually. That's something we pointed out in our article about the fascism debate. That's something that's like weirdly not remarked on very often in those debates. That like something that all actual historical fascist movements have in common is that they have this constant, glorification of war and militarism, and Trump really didn't, right? Which like to like a remarkable extent he didn't.
Yeah, the Vietnam line is the close. What do you say? The sexual revolution was my Vietnam. Is that the line?
No. That's right. He said that. I think what he said was not getting STDs in the 80s was his Vietnam. Yeah. Awesome. So let's see. Do we lose Forrest?
He also.
Okay, that's okay. That's okay. Katie, go.
No, I think it's like a weird combination, right? Because he definitely ran as an anti-war. He ran as a right-wing anti-war person, right? Like kind of an isolationist, obviously. Oh my God, I don't know if you guys encounter this. I can't stand this. If you want to say something like that, then you have people who think that they're really smart because they started studying politics and history like 5 minutes ago. They're like, he's not anti-war. He's racist.
Like,
he's not anti-imperialist. It's like, yeah, we know that. There's an entire history and political sector of people that hate war for the wrong reasons. So I'm just going to say that. I shouldn't even be, giving these people that attention, but it drives me crazy and I already start hearing it in my head. But he definitely, he did have at the same time, it's almost, the Soleimani thing is almost a perfect example. Like he had like no restraint. He like killed one dude and he killed other people. I'm not pretending.
I guarantee you Trump didn't know who the guy was when Mike Pompeo and Mike Pence came to him and were like, we have a terrorist.
I disagree. I think it's meme based. This was meme warfare. He did some really good Game of Thrones memes against Trump. They went back and forth. So maybe Pompeo told Trump about him, but I do think it was personal.
I don't know. I really don't think, I think that Trump put people in charge of his policy who were a bunch of militaristic, nationalistic, like Christian crusading psychos.
Like Pompeo.
He didn't really care. Trump doesn't have any principles. He didn't really care. He had some instincts against openly expanding the wars and stuff like that. And that was, of course, the one time he would get criticisms is when he would rhetorically be like, I want to draw down troops or I want to bring troops home. And then everybody would lose their minds. But what I think is interesting about this incoming administration is, it's not 2010 or 2011 anymore. Americans don't have an appetite for more war. And there's a lot more domestic things that need to be dealt with. There's this global pandemic that's devastated the US economy in a really dramatic way, but has also, I think, increased tensions with China. And I really think that's going to be, the future. We know that's the future, right? That's the future of warfare, is this growing Cold War with China, this great power competition. And I think the COVID issue accelerated that because China dealt with it. Their economy is doing great. They're one of the only economies that's growing. They're kind of like a normal country right now, nowhere else. And then the US is parties in Wuhan. Yeah, right. The US is just a complete disaster and people are facing economic ruin. The government still isn't really helping people. And it's just
I have a question for you, actually. I'm curious what you think about in light of that. What do you think about Xi sort of drawing back the Belt and Road Initiative? Because that's pretty interesting.
Can you explain what that is for listeners and viewers who don't know?
Oh, sure. So the Belt and Road Initiative was this big development effort undertaken by the PRC under Xi, and it was like there was a lot of writing about the last 3 to 5, 6 years about how this shows that China has like world ambitions and it's going to take over the world. And this was the big point for the new Cold War with China is the Belt and Road Initiative. That's what you'll find. That's what they point to, and sort of the creation of like counter-hegemonic institutions like the Asian Infrastructure Development, blah, blah, blah. But it's really the Belt and Road Initiative because it expands China into places like Africa. But what actually wound up going on with it was a lot of like the host countries weren't particularly happy because the initiative employed mostly Chinese workers and it wasn't necessarily how much benefit. And actually Xi, I think in the last 2 weeks, has basically announced that like that initiative is kind of done. So that's actually pretty interesting if we're like going to be China watchers, because that was like the thing that I think really would have gotten.
What next, right? Like, what's the next thing going to be? And I think also the what we hear more open complaints from like U.S. officials than the Belt and Road Initiative complaints and economic exploitation by China or whatnot is the communications issue. Like China's stealing our intellectual property because China's rising. And has made huge inroads in terms of like 5G technology, which, as we all know, is why we all have COVID. No, I'm just joking. But 5G technology, it's the future of communications. China has definitely surpassed the US. The US knows this. The Pentagon knows this. They say it in their papers. And that's why you constantly hear US officials complaining about intellectual property theft, because their whole thing is, oh, the only reason China's ahead in this technology is because they stole it from our companies, from American companies. That's our intellectual property. They're putting Huawei under sanction to try and deny them access to certain things they need in order to build their 5G infrastructure around the world. So that's really the real like future tension line with China. And I think it's just going to get dramatically worse even under Biden. And I mean, I don't know what that will mean for the Middle East, because I actually do think some of the people it's true that both parties are really bad on foreign policy, but I do think that, one positive aspect of having a Biden administration is going to be that there'll be less likely a war with Iran, right? Had there been a second Trump administration, we would have had a war with Iran, like no question. That's where we were headed. Now there's really a chance to move back towards diplomacy. And I also think that speaks to the US really moving out of the Middle East, not completely, but there's really, all of like, if you look at where American naval assets are, I don't know if this is an accurate number, but it's something like 2/3 to 3/4 of American naval assets are in Asia now.
Right. Endless war. I think Ronnie's exactly right. I think we're going to actually see that drawn down. I think especially because of the slow move off oil, which is going to really begin happening in the next 10, 15 years, and sort of coming at the end of these Afghanistan disaster is really going to see an end to endless war. The interesting thing is going to be where the U.S. community, including within like the so-called left, what we do with China. Because I think this is really interesting to me. I think there are some on the left who want good empire. Like I would call like the genuine left, the socialist left. You see this sort of trend, not necessarily in Jacobin, but you see it. And so it'll be really interesting. I think as one of the many things, I think that has the chance to maybe split the left a little bit over the approach.
Yeah. I think it already is. I think the issue of China already is splitting the left. I think there's a certain like segment of the left that is certain that it certainly sees China as like this huge tyrannical threat. Like they'll equate it like with fascism and they're Nazis and like they're genociding Uyghurs and just like all of these issues like are definitely already splitting the left. And then there's another, like there is like a growing, I think, which is a positive aspect, is there is a growing sense on the left that China is this new Cold War. And there's groups like Pivot to Peace that are arising that are, I think, doing really good work trying to like, manage that divide and like provide some resources on like why we shouldn't have a Cold War with China. But I don't think that, when I say escalation with war with China, like I don't think there'll actually be any sort of hot war at all. I don't think the US would ever be willing to take on China in that way, because China actually could actually put up a fight, unlike a lot of our other.
Yeah, the Chinese People's Liberation Army, I think, is actually the single biggest employer on the planet. But that might be wrong at this point. But I think I know that was true at one point. But yeah, I think there could be, even like I remember Sean Goody as an editor, Jacobin said this, like a division in a few different directions, within the left.
Great wall.
On China. Yeah. Well, a great wall that twists around so it divides people in a couple different directions. So, so there's the sort of like, socialism with Chinese characteristics is great view. There's the this is like Nazi Germany. It's actually good to have a Cold War with China view. And there's the there are, this is not what we, this is not the model of a society we want. There are real human rights issues here, but also a new Cold War with China would be disastrous view. But I do want to circle back to that, and I also want to circle back to the Iran thing. But let's watch the Palestine clips.